Well, if anyone went into this thinking they were about to see a Dolly Parton biopic, they were probably thrown for a hell of a loop, huh? What's happening? What's happening? What's happening? Welcome back into JC's Movies, where you can see all kind of movie and TV show content with me, JC, especially within the superhero, comedy, and horror genres. We'll be talking some horror today as we're going to dive into a review of Dolly, the 2026 movie, which, a slasher I'm always up for. So we'll definitely get into that. We'll talk some spoilers here. Spoiler warning. We'll get into those momentarily. But before I get there, just appreciate you guys watching this one. If you're a fan of those genres, be sure you subscribe here to the channel so we can talk some movies together. Plus, I'm bringing movie news updates every Monday through Friday with the Movie News Daily Show. And you can also help out by hitting the thumbs up button so this video hits the YouTube algorithm and finds other movie and TV show fans like you and me. And with that, let's talk a little bit about Dolly. Released in March, just now finally getting a chance to see it as it released earlier this month. Written and directed by, I believe it was Rod Blackhurst. Yeah, Brandon Weevil helping with the writing, but Rod Blackhurst wrote and directed this one. And before I get into the spoilers and talking about the plot, what I will say is the things I really like about this movie is it kind of throws back to some more old school style slashers. I got, old original Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibes multiple times through this movie. I'll touch on those when we get into the plot, but I love the way that it's filmed. I love the way they use the lighting in this one. Some of the tones that they use is very similar to, 80s slashers that you love. And I'm a sucker for slasher movies in general. So I really did enjoy that. You get some good gore here, some good carnage candy. But, with those being the positives, I think if you're coming into this looking for a ton of kills, you're not going to get that in this movie. I will tell you that right now. But despite that, you still will get some good moments of gore, some good carnage candy moments, and some decent little creepy moments mixed in with a little bit of dark comedy, I guess you could say, because there were times where it gives you like an eerie, creepy feeling, but also had me kind of giggling a little bit, just some of the way that stuff plays out, which we'll talk about momentarily. But I enjoyed this. I'd recommend you checking it out if you haven't yet. If you're a horror fan, if you're a slasher fan, I think you'll get into it, especially if you were fans of those, 70s, 80s slashers, which are some of my favorite movies in the genre. So with that out of the way, let's get set to dive in and talk about the plot of Dolly a little bit. Obviously, spoilers abound as we get into talking about this movie. All right, so right off the bat, we're into a cold open, and I love the look of the cold open. It gives you those creepy old school style vibes that I talked about there with the lighting, with the way that it's shot before you dive in and you get your first chapter heading, which I love the way that this movie's broken up into different chapters. And I think that one of the best things about this movie is it's quick and to the point. The pacing is great. I mean, this movie's like an hour and 15, hour and 20 minutes long, I think. And they divide it up into chapters. So it really is a breeze to sit through and watch this thing. But we get into our first chapter. Chapter 1 is titled Mother. And this is where we're introduced to the Sean William Scott character of Chase. He's dropping his daughter off at the aunt's house because he's going to be proposing to his girlfriend, Macy. He's taking her up on an overlook on a mountain. They got to hike through the woods to get there, thus setting up our, wood setting that we'll have throughout this movie when we come in contact with the other characters. And they kind of flash from that back to what we saw in that original cold open, when we get the shot of the creepy lady rocking back and forth. And I think I call her the porcelain lady a lot throughout my notes, because I don't know if she's supposed to be Dolly, if the other character is supposed to be Dolly, but just to make it easier, I'm going to call her Dolly, so I don't have to say the porcelain lady over and over throughout this review. But we get the shot of her rocking back and forth that we kind of saw originally in the cold open, but now we get a little bit more of it revealed, and we see that she was rocking back and forth with a headless corpse. Definitely catching some Texas Chainsaw Massacre vibes there, like almost like a female-esque Leatherface at times is what she felt like to me throughout this movie, and especially with some of the shots and some of the ways that they get into that throughout the movie. But from there, we see Dolly walking through the woods with the corpse, and we see her, take it to a place kind of in the middle of the woods where there's just a ton of dolls around. There's some nailed to trees, there's a bunch on the ground, and it feels kind of like a shrine almost. But we start to see, Chase and Macy hiking through the woods at this point as he's trying to get up to that overlook so he can propose to her. And they start seeing the dolls nailed to the trees at one point, and they're like, well, this is kind of weird. And Macy takes out some of the dolls and makes some funny jokes with it and stuff, but definitely creepy, or something you would, if you would walk up on that, you would definitely be concerned, I think. But I thought that this movie was going to take place in like the 70s or 80s, because it kind of just had those vibes, the way it was shot, everything. But then when they finally make it up to that overlook, chasing Macy. He pulls out a cell phone to start taking pictures. So I'm like, oh, I guess this is present day, which to me, I kind of wish they would have said it in the 70s, 80s. Like even his car, he's got like an old school Mustang. So I was like, oh, maybe this does take place in the 70s, but then that kind of gives it away that it's actually in modern day. And so he gets his cell phone out, starts taking some pictures, goes back to his bag where he's about to get the ring out to propose. He does grab the ring, starts to make his way over her, and they start hearing this eerie, creepy music, almost kind of reminiscent of like an ice cream truck or something like that, lullaby, whatever you want to call it. And so obviously that kind of changes things to where he's like, well, this is ruining the moment. I can't propose right now. So goes, puts the ring back in the bag and says he's going to go investigate and see where the music is coming from. He comes up on Dolly, who was there in the woods, like we talked about a few minutes ago, with that headless corpse. And she, for the first time turns around, and this is where we get the face reveal for the first time, which, I mean, we've seen some in the promotional images leading up to the film. I've covered it in Movie News Daily, but it's a porcelain mask that's kind of cracked up and stuff, but really an eerie look there with the porcelain mask on her. And she immediately grabs him by the throat, starts to lift him off the ground, throws him down, and then she gets a shovel, which I like that her kind of weapon of choice, her signature weapon, I guess you could say, is a shovel in this movie. But you get some gory stuff here and some stuff that just makes you cringe a little bit, because she immediately takes the shovel and like breaks his shin so he can't run, and then you see her insert it into his mouth and jam it in there, and you're like, oh, he's probably done for. But maybe not. But that ends chapter 1. Like I said, these chapters move quick. The movie moves quick. Then we go to chapter 2, which is titled Daughter. And we see Macy now searching through the woods, calling out for Chase, because obviously he didn't come back when he went to investigate the noise. She first finds that headless corpse that Dolly had, and then who's behind her? Dolly with that shovel. And when she turns around, she also then sees Chase leaned up against the tree, his jaw halfway hanging off. And that's just a great Carnage Candy moment, and you get to continually see that through the film. And I love that they used prosthetics and actual effects instead of CGI for that, because it really makes a difference here throughout this movie that she is doing that there, or that the filmmakers decided to do it that way with the prosthetic effects, and it looks really good. So she sees her and then starts running off, obviously yelling for help, and we get our first chase scene there. She makes it back to the overlook where they were and begins to look for things in the bag to try and fend off Dolly. She finds what I guess is a pocket knife, but of course she also comes across the ring, knowing that he was going to propose to her then at that point. But as soon as she finds that, Dolly pops up behind her with the shovel, and she takes off running again from Dolly, who obviously doesn't run. She's a killer in a slasher movie. She's not going to run after her. She's walking behind her. But of course, in typical slasher fashion, Macy trips and hits her head on a rock, knocking her up unconscious. When she wakes up, Dolly's standing over top of her, and she tries to shove her away, but Dolly smacks her, gives her a backhand. Macy then stabs her with that pocket knife in, kind of the hip groin area, and it seemingly has no effect on Dolly, which I thought was interesting. And then, of course, Dolly overpowers Macy, puts her over her shoulder, takes her back to the house, which gets us into chapter 3, which was titled Home. Macy wakes up, and she's now in a dress, like a child looking dress, and she's inside of a baby's crib, which is just kind of one of those moments that I was talking about earlier where it kind of makes you laugh a little bit, because she's inside this crib, but she obviously doesn't fit. So her legs are just kind of hanging over the edge and such. Someone then calls her over to the wall from that room. You hear a male's voice, like in the next room over supposedly, and the voice sounds very weak, coughing a lot, but tells Macy, hey, you have to play along and be her new doll. But tells her that, if she wants to make it out, she has to find a key as well, which kind of serves as our MacGuffin throughout the rest of this movie. And right here is when I start to notice, especially when she first wakes up in the room and she's talking to that man, like the blue and red lighting tones that they use throughout this movie, those deep blues, those blue tinted lights remind me so much of the, old 80s horror movies, the kind of setting and atmosphere of those movies. And I really love the use of that throughout here. That's probably one of my favorite things in the movie, is the way that it's shot, and just kind of the use of lighting that they use really harkens back to some old school slashers, which is right up my alley personally. Dolly then comes in and almost like seemingly overjoyed that Macy is awake. She's like clapping her hands, and almost gave me, Terrifier vibes with Art the Clown, the way he is sometimes. And that you get that from Dolly sometimes in this movie, because she doesn't talk or anything. She like makes these weird crying, like, I don't know, sounds, humming sounds almost underneath the mask. You can hear those sometimes, but she doesn't talk. So it's almost very mime-esque, just like, kind of in a Terrifier way. But Now that Macy's awake, she picks her up, carries her into the kitchen, lays her on a table, and you start to realize what she's going to do, because they had zoomed in when Dolly came in. Macy was scared, and she pissed running down her leg. She peed herself, and so Dolly comes in, lays her on the table. You're like, is she about to put a diaper on her? And she she goes, grabs a diaper, and Macy's like, no, 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 I don't need that. And she puts a pacifier in her mouth at that point and begins to put a diaper on her. And that's the moment. It's like, it's creepy, it's eerie, but also it's like a little bit of dark comedy-esque as well, because it kind of makes you laugh in those moments at the same time. From there, we get a surprising shot that I didn't think would happen, and that's Chase waking up in the woods. So he's not dead. His jaw's just hanging on by a thread, and he immediately tries to stand up, and of course, with what she did to his shins with the shovel, he's not able to. Immediately falls back over, passes out, either from landing on his head or from the pain, or both. So we know that he's still alive, though. We do get that shot at that point. And then back in the house, Macy attempts to run, but Dolly catches her and throws her down. And just the shot here, when she throws her down in this hallway, I was like, is that actually a man in the porcelain mask pretending to be a lady? Because I couldn't quite tell, because she's obviously extremely strong. She overpowers everyone in this movie, and just like her build, I was like, man, that's a big lady. If that's a lady, it almost looks like a linebacker, like a dude. So I started to question that, but I would have that question answered momentarily, and we'll get to that. That's one of the more crazy scenes here as we get to it just in a second. But afterwards, she, gets Macy back to the kitchen, and talk about dark comedy right here. This is definitely one of the more funny moments, because she's pissed because Macy tried to run away. So she bends her over the table, gets a paddle, and begins giving her a spanking. So she obviously is, wanting to treat Macy as her daughter. She's wanting to be the mother in this situation. And then cut back to the woods. Chase reawakens, and he's not giving up. He's starting to, just pull himself with his arms, because he can't stand up. He's going to try and pull himself all the way through the woods. From there, we're back in the house, in the kitchen. Now Dolly's trying to feed Macy some baby food. She spits it up. So the late Dolly goes to, the fridge, freezer, grabs a bottle, and is going to feed her that instead. And I'm like, is that breast milk in that bottle? Is that breast milk? Was immediately my question that popped in my head. And then Macy, tries to drink it, tries to take the bottle from her, and immediately vomits it up. So then I'm like, oh yeah, that's definitely breast milk. And so then Dolly's like, okay, that didn't work. Let me try option number 3 here. And she kind of gets enraged that she won't take the food, won't take the milk out of the bottle. And then so Dolly decides to be more direct, and this is where my previous question of is that a man or a woman is definitely answered, because she says, I'm gonna go straight to the source then, and pulls out her breast and puts her nipple in Macy's mouth and is going to breastfeed her straight from the source then. And I'm like, holy shit, this is wild. And then that's not even the most wild part, because Macy acts like she's going to cooperate, and then obviously just bites down, and I believe bites her nipple clean off. And I was like, holy shit. And you see a lot of blood. Dolly's on the ground, and of course Macy then runs back into the room where she heard the man's voice, and asks her if she's found the key yet, and she says, no, I don't know where it is. He tells her to check the basement, calling it Dolly's special place, and tells her not to forget him once she finds the key. So she finds a pair of scissors on the ground at that point, kind of waits for Dolly to come back into the room, and then she pops out behind her, stabs her in the back, and then makes a run for the basement. So she enters the basement, and we see the basement is full of a ton of lit candles and an unbelievable amount of dolls. And then one of the dolls is sitting in like a rocking chair, and it's a doll body, but it has a human head on it, and that's what the key is on that necklace. And immediately at this point, I'm like, is this a Jason and Mrs. Voorhees situation? Like, is that Dolly's mom's head right there on that doll's body, and she has it in this shrine? That was definitely, a little bit of Friday the 13th vibes. I know you get a ton of TCM vibes throughout this movie, but then I'm like, this seems like a Jason and Miss Voorhees situation, when he had her head on the shrine there in part 2 and such. That's what it felt like to me for sure. But she manages to get the key off that doll / human head, and as soon as she does, we see all of a sudden somehow Dolly snuck down there, pops up, and brings her back upstairs, and doing it by her ear. And this is, you get a nice little gore moment here as well, because she throws her back down and her ear is literally hanging on by a thread. Another great prosthetic, another great practical effect there that this movie has. And at that point, Macy tries to get smart and begins to hum kind of a lullaby, which soothes Dolly, who was kind of enraged at that moment. Dolly sits down in a rocking chair and then picks Macy up into her arms and begins to rock her back and forth in that rocking chair, and then pulls out a needle and thread and starts to sew Macy's ear back on as well. And that kind of ends chapter 3 and brings us into chapter 4, which the title here in chapter 4 is Father. And we see Macy awaken. It's, the next morning, supposedly. She's still in that rocking chair in the lap of Dolly, and she manages to get up without awakening her. Dolly's still asleep in the rocking chair, but Dolly has the key with the necklace, around her neck. So she has to then try and remove that without waking her up as well, which surprisingly, I was surprised she actually accomplished that. And then Macy goes to the door where the man had told her not to forget about him. She unlocks the door and using that key, and it's pitch black in that room. He tells her that, there's a flashlight somewhere on the floor. She finds it and shines it on him, and we see he's chained up. But damn, as soon as I saw this, dude, I was like, is that Charles Manson? Dude looked just like Charles Manson back in the day. Beard, long hair. It was almost uncanny. I was like, what the hell? And maybe that was on purpose. But anyway, he tells her that same key unlocks his chains, and says he's been like that for months, ever since Dolly's mom got sick. So we're getting a little bit of hint of backstory throughout here from, kind of this point on. And he says he'll explain it more once she frees him. So she unlocks the chains, but then begins to shine the flashlight around the room. And when she does, she sees the walls are kind of soaked in blood, and there's another dead body in the room. So the man, all of a sudden, you kind of realize, oh shit, he's probably not the best guy either. And he grabs Macy from behind and, has her kind of at knife point, begins to play with her hair, stating, I taught her well. Oh, I taught her well. So you're like, oh, this is, kind of the family from TCM in an odd way. Although he's not necessarily supporting Dolly as much as they're kind of rivals as well. It's an odd dynamic. Anyway, they make their way downstairs, and he starts yelling up to Dolly, saying, hey, baby girl, I got your little plaything here. Come down before I slit her throat, because he's trying to get her to wake up, because the bar that's on the door to leave the house is so heavy that he can't lift it. Only Dolly can lift it, which tells you about, her kind of abnormal strength as well. So he cuts Macy's face so that she'll scream and wake up Dolly. He says, I'm going to do to her what I did to you unless you get your ass down here now. So that little bit of dialogue there, I think, explains to us, why she wears the porcelain mask. Obviously, this father character, did something to her face, which we get some shots of later, and it's pretty gnarly. But nonetheless, Dolly then comes down with her shovel in hand, that signature weapon. The father then convinces her to drop the shovel because he threatened to, kill Macy. Dolly then removes the bar on the door, and as soon as he does, the man begins to beat Dolly with the shovel. Macy tries to make a run for it at this point while she thinks he's distracted, but he immediately swings the shovel around and knocks her down as hitting her in the face with the shovel. So he stands over, the porcelain lady, Dolly, whatever you want to call her, and says, you should have killed me, baby girl, and buried me out back with the rest of them. So also letting us know, not the first time this has happened. Very much, TCM-esque there in that aspect. He stands over Dolly at that point, and we see Macy is up. She grabs a knife and stabs the father character in the back, which causes him to turn around. And as soon as he does, Dolly then stands up. And this right here is where I'm like, so Dolly is definitely has some supernatural type aspects for sure. We knew about the abnormal strength, but this is next level, and probably the best kill scene in the movie, because she punches a hole through the dude's back all the way through his chest, and we just see a hole in the middle of his body, and we see Dolly's face poke through it, and I was like, wow, I didn't see that coming at all. I said, holy chest burster. I mean, it's very much, kind of a nod to that chest burster scene in Alien, but it's a fist punching through someone's body, which is crazy. And then obviously he's probably dead at that point, but Dolly wants to make sure of it, begins, enragingly smashing his face with the shovel as well. And then Dolly grabs Macy, takes her back upstairs, and puts her in that rocking chair from earlier before Dolly starts to, freak out, slamming things around the room, breaking the crib that we saw Macy in earlier. And then she grabs Macy by the throat, and we're like, oh, she's about to kill her now. She's lifting her off the ground. But Macy says, Mommy, please. And that causes her to let her go. And then we hear from outside, Chase has made his way to the house somehow, and we hear him yelling for Macy, although it's very mumbled, very distorted because, his jaw's halfway clean, hanging off. And then this is where you get one of our two big TCM nods. And, in the original TCM, Sally jumps out the glass window, and soon as Macy hears Chase yelling for her, she immediately runs, jumps straight out the glass window, although she's on the second story, so it's a hell of a fall. But that's when I was like, oh man, definite TCM vibes right there for sure. If I didn't have enough already, that was certainly a nod. I think that, this director was definitely a fan of that movie and made kind of his own version of it, his own twisted version of it here, which I was a fan of myself. And that ends chapter 4, which gets us to chapter 5, probably one of the most brief chapters, but it's titled Reunion. Macy makes her way over to Chase and tries to get him up so they can escape, but obviously his legs, all messed up. Dolly then shows up with her shovel and hits Macy. Looks like she's going to attack Macy, but then Chase makes his way to his feet to, kind of sacrifice himself for Macy, basically, because Dolly comes over to him and we see her stick her hands in his mouth and rip his jaw the rest of the way off. Crazy effect right there. Another gnarly moment for sure. Macy then begins to run away. Another chase ensues. And when she catches up to Macy, Macy fights back and we see her hit part of that porcelain mask and break it. And that's what leaves kind of the hole where we get to see a little bit into that face here coming up in a minute. But that causes Dolly to run away at that point. I guess she's kind of embarrassed by that. And so Macy tries to run off and leave the woods, but she falls into a hole that's looks like basically a grave that's been dug, surrounded by dolls. And I think that this is what, Dolly was doing earlier, was that's why she had the shovel. She was digging this grave for that corpseless body, that headless corpse, that we saw earlier. And that ends kind of chapter 5, which brings us to chapter 6, which was titled Fight. And Macy's stuck in this hole when, this chapter begins. Dolly shows back up at that point, begins to swing the shovel down in there, but can't hit Macy. And Macy finds the headless corpse down in that hole, that grave that Dolly had dug earlier, I'm guessing. And that causes Dolly to freak out and come into the hole because she doesn't want her to mess with that corpse, I'm guessing. And Macy throws the corpse at Dolly, which, distracts her enough for her to be able to get up out of the hole. And then she gets that shovel that Dolly had dropped to come in there and begins attacking Dolly as she holds the headless corpse, hitting her, multiple times in the face because Dolly was really concerned about this corpse. She was holding it, not paying attention at that point. And Macy begins to attack her. So she's knocked out. And Macy then, sees on her hand, she has the engagement ring that Chase had planned to give to her. And she wants to retrieve that. So she's going to jump in there and get that ring off of Dolly's finger. At this point, you can kind of see what's about to happen here. Obviously, that's probably going to awaken her. And indeed, it does. She grabs her arm, for that, right when you think the killer's dead, they give you one last scare moment, right? And so when she wakes up and grabs her arm, that's when the camera kind of gives us a nice shot inside of that porcelain mask. And it is gnarly looking, man. I'm not too sure what happened to her, but her face is definitely very gnarly looking for sure. And that ends chapter 6, which gives us to chapter 7, Goodbye. So Macy makes her way out of the hole, runs, far enough away to run into a park ranger who is there, jamming some heavy metal music on his headphones so he doesn't see Macy coming. She kind of sneaks up on him, gives him a little jump scare. She attempts to tell him what happened, that a woman in a porcelain doll mask did this to her when he asks if it was some type of animal, because she's obviously covered in blood, very distraught, all of those things. And what I think is interesting here is then he kind of radios to, I guess, the other rangers or whatever, and says, we've got another one, same story, lady in a porcelain doll mask. So yet again, another hint that this has happened before, but I don't know if they haven't believed the people or if they've just never been able to locate Dolly or what. So we kind of get that hint here as well, which I like, kind of the subtlety of just kind of throwing it in lines of dialogue, a little bit of the backstory. It's not too much exposition, and it really doesn't hurt, the pace of this movie. Like I said, this movie's paced really well, but he tells Macy to get into his car. She gets into the car. The park ranger begins to make his way over to the driver's seat. And of course, Dolly shows up and comes up behind him as he's trying to get in, hits him with the shovel, and then in one swing decapitates him with the shovel. Yet again, that superhuman strength that she has on display there. Macy moves over to the driver's seat at that point and starts the car up. and runs over Dolly. She then gets out to attempt to retrieve her ring again, which I was shocked. I was like, you really going to try and get that damn ring again? And I was expecting another, jump scare of her to wake up again. But she's able to get the ring, get back in the car, successfully removing it, from Dolly's finger, getting back into the car and driving off in the park ranger's car. And then she puts the ring on her finger, and you see her look down at it, and she starts to smile a little bit, and she's got the blood on her face. And the movie ends with her just maniacally laughing as she drives away. And that's when I was like, that's definitely another TCM moment, because it almost mirrors the end of the original Texas Chainsaw when Sally Hardesty is in the back of that truck maniacally laughing as she finally gets away. Here we get Macy, maniacally laughing as she's driving away. Definitely same vibes as that OG TCM ending, which I really love. I love those little nods and callbacks, and I love the feel of this movie. It's kind of, grindhouse feel, old school slasher feel. So that's our final shot, is her driving off, maniacally laughing. So for me, I think the pacing is great. I love the practical effects. I love the lighting. I love the way it's shot. I would have, liked some more kills, I guess, is probably one of the downsides of it. And I think that maybe you could have thrown another 15 minutes into this movie and done that. But I also think the pacing, like I said, is really good as well, because it goes by like that, like a breeze. So I don't know, neither here nor there on that aspect of it, but I would love to see more from this. I think that Dolly could become, a slasher that has a movie come out ever so often, and we could continue on with this franchise. I think it'd be good. I think if you're a fan of slashers, you'll enjoy this one. And so for me, being the fan of slashers that I am, especially from the 70s and 80s, and how this movie kind of had a lot of different nods to those, I really enjoyed this one. I recommend it. As far as my rating is concerned, I'm going to give this a pretty good rating. I think this is a 7.0 out of 10 for me. I liked Dolly. If you've seen it, let me know your thoughts on it in the comments below. What are your complaints? What are your pros? What are your cons? All of those good things. Not too many complaints from me, but it's also almost too straightforward at times. I know that I feel like I'm kind of contradicting myself with that a little bit, but I don't know. I guess I just wanted more. I just wanted a little bit more because I did enjoy it. Maybe that's the best way to put it. But like I said, good movie for me. I enjoyed it, but I could see some people that maybe don't feel the same way, and that's fine. If you do, that's what's beautiful about movies, is I always like to throw in here, they're subjective and we can all have different opinions on them. But you've heard mine throughout the video. Let me know yours down in the comment section. I appreciate those interactions. They help me grow the channel here on JC's Movies. And be sure to hit the like button before you leave, and subscribe to the channel for future movie reviews, movie news updates, and all those good things here on JC's Movies. I'd appreciate that, just like I appreciate you tuning into this one, and I will catch you on the next one.